Let's talk about a couple ways that you can help the surgeon when he's suturing. So if they are closing an incision and they're below the epidermis, they're not doing the running subcuticular yet. They're doing either the dermis or the fascia. They're going to have to pull back the skin edge and pull up the fascia or that deeper layer that they're looking for. So you're sitting there as the assistant, you're following with one suture, with one hand. With the other hand, you have your scissors ready to cut for them. So if they're looking for that layer, you can help them out by using their scissors to push back the epidermis a little bit and expose that layer for them. Then they'll be able to go right ahead and grab it and suture it without having to lift up the skin first, because you're already doing that for them. So that's helpful for them. When they're doing that skin incision, it's helpful if they're taking that stitch to give them a little counter traction, because it's always easiest to pull against the counter traction. So you're giving them something to pull, so they'll be able to suture faster. And if you need to, for them, you can also align the incision. If you see that it's not quite straight, or you can pull a little bit on the side. Some of them will tell you never mind, but others will find it helpful. So if you feel like it's necessary or appropriate, go ahead and give a little tension and it'll help align the incision. Say you're closing you have a small incision like this, but he's closing it. Say they did a minimally invasive bowel and he wants to close the incision, and they're getting down near the end. So they're taking a big needle like this, or bigger, probably bigger than this, and they're closing the fascia way down deep. And you're following for them. You're pulling on each one and keeping it tight so that it'll keep the fascia together. And they're coming down along that incision. They have a huge needle, and the incision's getting smaller and smaller, right? So you're following with it. Now they're getting down here. If this gets stuck too, so you just have to know what to do with it. Now they only have a little bit. They have this huge needle that they're trying to get the small incision. They're never going to be able to get it in here if you don't do something to help them make it easier. We have to keep the tension so you can keep the fascia closed. So when they get to about here, for those last 2 stitches that they're going in, instead of pulling that suture through for them, you're going to take your 2 fingers and you're going to go through the loops and hold it up for them, right? Now, say there's only 1 more stitch here. Now you're keeping tension, so you're keeping the fascia closed here, but at the same time, by keeping these up like this, you're keeping this wide enough that they can get that corner stitch in with this. I'm trying to be 2 people at once, the surgeon and the assistant. So they would be taking that last stitch while you're holding up. So you've been holding up, you're keeping this tight, and now they would take it and they have their final stitch in, so now they can feed it up. And you're still holding this, and they can feed it up and they can complete their closure because you've held it for them. And you've kept your fingers in there to keep that last little bit of the wound open so they can get in the corner. So what do you do if they have a bleeder how can you help with that? If they're doing a suture ligature on a bleeder, that means that it's a very brisk bleed, and it would be easy for that area to pool with blood and for it to obliterate the area, and you won't be able to see where that bleeder's coming from. So they're going to go in on one side of the bleeder. Here's the bleeder here, right? So what do you do as the first assistant? And again, I'm probably going to try to do 2 roles here. So now he's ready. He's going to be reloading that suture. While he's doing that, you grab the free end and the end that he's just done, and you lift up. Now what that does is, by lifting against these 2 sutures, and you have to make sure you leave him enough that he can continue to work with, because he's going to do figure 8. He's going to go on the other side of that to tie it off, so he makes sure he catches the bleeder. But if the blood supply is coming from this way, which is frequently what happens, when you lift up on that, it's going to occlude that vessel, and it's going to stop bleeding long enough for him to see where he's going, and for him to put his stitch in. Pretend you're still holding up. For him to put a stitch in the other side, and then you just release and let him tie. And he's got his figure 8, and now he'll be able to tie that, and you've helped with that. If they're doing a vascular and they're stitching the graft in on a vascular case like a carotid, they're going to be running around with a simple running stitch all the way around. So you're going to be following that. Usually when you follow, on most cases, I'll hold like this. But if I don't time it right, sometimes that's a very fine vessel that they're working on. And if I don't time it right and they go to pull it out and I'm not quite ready to release it, it jerks a little bit. I could tear that a little bit. So when I'm doing a vascular, I like to hold it between here, because this doesn't hold it quite as tightly. When I release with these two fingers, or don't release, it's not going to jerk. It's going to pull it out on my fingers before it would tear that. So I like to follow the vascular cases with these two fingers. If they're sewing in a graft, and say the graft is here and the tissue is here, well, they're doing a graft because probably, unless it's for like a tramp flap, the tissue, they're probably doing a graft because the tissue isn't good to begin with, right? So you have your graft material here, which is strong, and you're trying to follow it. Where do you pull? Do you pull against here, which is the tissue, or tear it, or do you pull against the graft material as you're following? I would rather pull against the graft material, because that's going to, when possible, you can't always do it, but when possible, I'm going to do my tension on the graft material side, because that's less likely to tear and do damage.